Hi, I'm live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you guys. This time covering Swords of the North, which is a collection of Robert E. Howard stories that has a pretty interesting history. It's from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press, and historically, they have put out very, very small print runs of really interesting collections. But because it's all been in small print runs, I think the original of this was only like 200 copies or something. They've become very expensive, right? And so not super easy for a more casual reader to get a hold of. Um, and they seem to have changed that. I don't know if they're doing any print runs themselves directly. I think in print, a lot of their new stuff is all in print on demand through, I know Amazon has a print on demand service, and it looks like that's what it is. Hard to tell precisely for certain, although I'm sure if I purchased a physical copy, you'd be able to tell. But in digital, also, they're essentially the same text as the other versions. But I read on my Kindle mostly nowadays. I don't know about mostly, but probably the majority is on digital. So that's why I read this, Swords of the North. I think this specific cover that's up might be the original cover and not the new cover. I don't remember for certain, but Swords of the North is a really neat collection of short stories by Robert E. Howard. You have a an earlier version of The Frost Giant's Daughter that stars Amra of Akbatana instead of Conan of Samaria, which is neat to see. It's very much The Frost Giant's Daughter that you are probably familiar with, but from an earlier draft. Um, and then you have a number of the James Allison stories, and James Allison is a um, Howard character who himself envisions or experiences other Howardian characters. He's James is a man of Howard's own time who had I think one of the stories specifies that he had a bad fall from a horse and broke his leg, and it never healed back right, and also seems to suffer from some type of unnameable malaise, which seems one obvious reading would be to see what James Allison is afflicted with is not necessarily a bacterial infection or a viral disease, but is really grim depression, um, much like we know that Robert E. Howard himself suffered from at times. Um, Anyway, but James Allison, the modern Texan, has this remarkable ability to remember his past lives, the earlier lives of his spirit or soul in history. And so there are, I think, three of the published James Allison stories in the front, and then there's a couple more fragments in the back. The last, I don't know, 100 pages or so of Swords of the North is all kind of fragments and drafts and stuff, which is interesting. I went ahead and read all of it. It's probably the weakest section of the book in terms of what a casual reader is likely to be interested in, because it's really more, understanding Robert E. Howard's kind of process as he developed the stories rather than specifically the finished tales that are so much fun to read. So I wouldn't feel bad necessarily about skipping it if you're not interested in it, but it's there and it's pretty cool if that's what you're interested in. There are a couple places where you can see, like, there will be a summary of a planned story and then a fragment of the draft of that story, or a couple of other, there's at least one place where there's an earlier draft and a later draft, and it's cool to see how the kind of um, rougher and less polished framework of the story, and its earlier version has turned into a more developed story later on, right? I think that's one of the Cormac MacArt stories. But anyway, so we have these James Allison stories that are really fascinating particularly Marchers of Valhalla is really neat. It's a great story. I definitely read it before in, I don't remember which collection. I don't think it was in a specifically Robert E. Howard. I think it was in maybe one of the Sword and Sorcery kind of greatest hits collections from DMR Books. That sounds right. And it was also fun because I have recently been watching another YouTuber named Grammaticus Books, who's got some cool stuff and has a video specifically about Marchers of Valhalla. So it's or Marchers from Valhalla. I don't remember the specifics of the title, but it was fun to see that story. That story is really interesting. It's basically these kind of mythologized sort of Viking like northerners who have marched down from somewhere in like the Great Lakes region or even in Canada down to prehistoric Texas and found a civilization there and interact with the people there. And there's all this kind of craziness that goes on, but it's sort of this imagined prehistory of Robert E. Howard's homeland. And so there's something fascinating about that. And then you also have, I think, all of the Cormac MacArt stories, which Cormac MacArt is an Irish reaver who is the right hand man to a sort of Viking renegade, and they go around and get into trouble, and it's all the classic Howardian hero stuff. And then all of the Turla O'Brien stories, who he's similarly a kind of classic Howardian hero. He's an outcast who is deadly with his axe, and who gets into all sorts of nasty trouble and has a serious temper and all that sort of stuff. Um, and a number of other kind of fill in the gap stories, I guess you might say. So like Kings of the Night is in here, which is the kind of crossover Bran McMorn and Cull of Volusia story, which is a lot of fun. Great short story. The Dark Man is in here, which is sort of a crossover Bran McMorn and Turla O'Brien story, and is just one of my favorites. It's such an incredible atmosphere on that story. That's the one where there's a, a sort of statue or an icon of Bran McMorn that gets stolen and ends up being present at violence, and there's such a, I think that story in particular is one that I really love. It's so kind of atmospheric and kind of fascinating in the way it's told, I suppose. This kind of sense of the space that all of the things that happen inhabit is really interesting and evocative and all that. Anyway, and then you have a number of other, like I said, kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of fill in the gaps. And so there's a couple of stories that are, I think, from fairly early in Robert E. Howard's career that are much more about kind of they're sort of like modern day ghost stories in some cases, or fiction that involves this kind of modern characters interacting with relics of the past in some ways. And those are interesting because you don't necessarily see those stories in collections nearly as much, because I think that a lot of them have been pretty thoroughly overshadowed by the later Robert E. Howard stuff that we think of as kind of definitively Howardian, right? Um, so neat stuff. And then there's a fair bit of poetry mixed in throughout. And there's a foreword also that talks about Robert E. Howard and kind of the things that he liked and was interested in, and specifically about the poetry. There's some talk about G.K. Chesterton's The Ballad of the White Horse and how that was really impactful for young Bob Howard and thinking about kind of the things that he wanted to write in the story. And there's a kind of long narrative poem that is apparently, at least in part, inspired by the Ballad of the White Horse. Um, so there's a lot of these different things, and like I said, the kind of end of the collection is probably about 100 pages of fragments and drafts and all of the things that never were quite finished within Robert E. Howard's lifetime. A number of short stories. I think they're divided up into the three kind of big characters in this collection. So there's a collection of James Allison fragments and drafts, and a collection of Cormac McArt fragments and drafts, and a collection of Turla O'Brien fragments and drafts, and then a kind of final section that's sort of miscellaneous stuff and a lot of poetry in there. Uh, I think the presumably unfinished poetry, or at least poetry that he never kind of put his stamp on. It was in his papers at the end of his life without having been necessarily polished in the way of the other stuff. Although it's still quite good, and it's interesting if you are interested in Robert E. Howard as a writer beyond being interested in reading the things that Robert E. Howard wrote and put out into the world. I think is the way to get at that. So um, anyway, I guess the sort of core thing you probably already know if you like Robert E. Howard stories. If not, a number of them are in the public domain by now, so you can go read a couple and decide if you like those stories. If you do like those stories and you want to read something that isn't Conan, or that isn't the Del Rey put out a whole line of Robert E. Howard collections that are really good. And so there's, excuse me, three for Conan in that collection, and there's a Brad McMorn and a Cull, and a couple other kind of similar to this ones that have multiple characters. So I think there's one for Alborak, and there's one for I think it's called like Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures, and there's one for Solomon Kane, and all of those sorts of stuff. This is kind of a different take on the Howardian collection, because you have a number of stories that are all sort of thematically connected and connected in a sense by, like, it talks about the swords of the north, this kind of idea of these kind of Viking and Celtic interactions that Howard is so fascinated by in his more historical stuff. Um, so anyway, it's a really good collection, I will say. I think this one's a lot of fun. A number of the stories appear in other places, so if you're like me and have read a fair bit of Sword and Sorcery, you may well have read some, or even perhaps all of the stories in here. Probably not all, because I think there's some that are pretty rarely anthologized nowadays, but are interesting to see. Often there'll be, something that there's a couple of places where we have like a story kind of similar to something like Kings of the Night, where we have Bran McMorn and Cull, but it's actually told from a third perspective of Cormac, not the same Cormac McArt of the other adventures, but a similar character in a lot of ways. Um, and there's a number of kind of places like that where you get this kind of, um, for lack of a better term, almost the sort of evolutionary development of one character's adventures, or one kind of running through line of a particular thematic concern. And I think that's at the really that's why read this collection. Aside from the fact that there are all these good stories in here that are at times hard to find. So yeah, like I said, If you like Robert E. Howard, this is a collection that is totally worth picking up. I think I paid like $10 on Kindle for it, and it's 500 pages or something. So um, really, really a lot of fun. This set of stories worth checking out if you like this sort of thing. So yeah, that's kind of all I have to say about that. Anyway, hope you have enjoyed. If you have read this particular collection, if you have opinions about any of the short stories in this collection, any of the ones I mentioned in particular, I think all of those stories are super fun and worth talking about in more detail at some point if I ever get around to that and want to do something kind of more in depth about it, a specific story. Um, that would be fun to do. Otherwise, hope you will check out the book if it sounds like something that will interest you. I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland. I will see you next time. Take care, everybody, and happy reading.